Cool. So I think it's recording now. So let's just go ahead and get started. Today's workshop will be working with your startup team and basically build an effective communication, what leadership is and culture. The check-in code will be startup team building with a 3, and it will be at acmucsc.com. Cool. So I'll just go into a bit of introduction. So as covered by the last workshop, there is no such thing as a solo entrepreneur, right? So in order to scale a business or a company, you can't do this alone. It has to be done with a team and with other people supporting you. And essentially, since you can't do this alone, you need to find the right people to work with, as this can make or break your startup, right? Having the right people to work with can be really beneficial for you because you have a support system, you can generate new ideas, you can move further in the direction that you sort of envisioned, right? But with the wrong people, there can be a lot of conflicts and just a lot of problems in the startup that could eventually lead to a team crash. I think I read this statistic somewhere online where 23% of startup failures actually arise from teams and just not finding the right fit within a team. So building the right team is super important, which was sort of covered in the last workshop as well, just to reiterate on that. But once you build a great team, you need to be able to work effectively with them, right? So how do you communicate? How do you build a positive culture? How to lead a team? How do you build strong communication settings and more? And that's sort of what we'll cover in this sort of workshop here. Cool. So the motivation for this is any successful startup will take time. You have to really think about it in terms of a long term, right? Most companies really, it takes off at least, it takes several years to take off, sometimes 10, 15 years. So you have to really come with the mindset to take this into a long term journey, right? And what this means is that you have to really understand how to manage and optimize your relationships with your founders and your other team members, right? Because these are relationships that are going to last a very long time, especially as you continue to work at the startup with your teammates, right? So you want to basically make sure you understand what the best way to sort of communicate with them, work with them, and etc. And yeah, just working with your team members is going to be a really big part of the startups and understanding how to manage your relationships here. And one example that I want to bring up is it's about marriage. There's a guy, John Gottman. He's a marriage researcher. He's been doing this. He's been in this field for many years, and basically, he's able to predict whether a couple will stay together or, I guess, divorce within 15 minutes of an argument, basically, right? So this percentage actually even goes up to 94% when they spend around an hour with them. So basically, this guy has been doing this for many years and he's able to predict effectively whether, a couple is going to stay together or, basically end up divorced, right? And what he discovered was that there's something about the way that couples will have an argument that determines the longevity of the relationship, right? Turns out that everybody, all couples are just all relationships, there will be conflicts and fights that arise, right? But it's not really the fact that you guys fight that matter, but how you communicate and resolve it, right? And so this marriage example can really translate into startups and founders in your team since you'll be working with them for a very long time, sort of like a marriage, right? You guys are in a relationship for many, many years. So some of the discoveries that Gottman made can be also applied to startups. Okay. And so these are sort of the main conflicts that could arise with as you guys are working together on a team. And these are like the three major things that you want to avoid. So the first topic that I want to cover is criticism. And criticism is basically the idea that, or I guess criticism regarding multiple topics. And it's basically the idea that we don't fight on one topic, but rather we bring all these other issues into play together instead of addressing that one issue at hand, right? So one example of this could be, hey, you know what? I have a serious concern about this bug that we're trying to fix, and I'm really worried about this thing, right? And I'm not sure that we're going to be able to deploy on time. And your partner goes, well, you know what? I don't like, well, you know what I don't like is the fact that you leave a bunch of dirty dishes in the sink, right? Basically, it's just a funny example, just reinforcing the fact that you want to stay within one topic at a hand and try to resolve that first before moving on to other things, right? That could lead to a bigger and bigger mess within the team. Second topic that you really want to avoid is contempt, right? And what this means is the intention to insult. So basically, an example of this would be like, hey, I'm worried about this bug. We're not going to be able to deploy this on time. And someone says, well, oh, well, I don't like your face, right? That's contempt. And basically, what you want to do with this is you want not to keep things personal, right? And lastly, the third topic that you want to avoid is being irresponsible, right? And so what this means is not owning up to your mistakes and just basically ignoring when there's a problem, right? So let's say you are in charge of one facet of the company, right? And something's not working right. By ignoring that and essentially saying, hey, this is not my problem, that can turn into a big issue in the company as well. Okay, so now that we've covered conflicts, so these are sort of the strategies for resolution of these conflicts. And you want to really consider these strategies beforehand and make plans while you guys are all in sort of like a solid emotional state, which basically means you guys are angry at each other or in conflict and just kind of in that mode where you guys are able to think clearly about some of the things that you can do to prevent and I guess address these conflicts that will arise eventually in a startup, right? Because they will arise eventually, especially if you guys are thinking about this in the long term vision where you guys are working together for many years. So you want to basically be prepared and just beforehand before the conflicts arise because it's a lot harder to think and just resolve things when you guys are both in an angry state or an emotional state, and it's really hard to think logically and pragmatically in that state. So one of the strategies that you can sort of use to resolve conflicts would be the divide and conquer strategy. And what this strategy means is that from an early stage of a startup, you want to make sure you divide the roles and responsibilities clearly, right? So some of these roles could be like, business stuff, right? And tech. Essentially distributing tasks and roles in a way that is, as evenly as possible and making sure that whatever responsibilities are clearly defined. So later on, when conflicts do arise and there's an issue in one category, we know exactly who's responsible for that. And so they can sort of own up to that mistake and move things along from there, right? But if there's sort of like a unclear understanding of the division of responsibilities, when conflicts do arise, it could be a lot harder to resolve because no one's really going to be able to be held responsible for this. And that way, it's just a little murky, right? People are going to start pointing fingers, etc. So we want to make sure from an early point in the startup, you want to define roles and responsibilities in a clear way. Second resolution strategy would be to document a process slash plan for when conflicts arise, right? So this means writing a clear plan for what you will do when there is a conflict that occurs, right? So making sure you have some sort of strategy or sort of what steps you'll take when that conflict arises so that, and making sure that you document stuff when like conflicts arise, right? This some companies actually have a system like some sort of framework to resolve conflicts. So whenever a conflict occurs, they essentially put this in like some sort of spreadsheet to track what the details of the conflict were, who were involved, etc. And that way they can sort of see this pattern of like what are some of the big issues that we constantly are running into, right? And just understanding from like a very high level sort of perspective, just understanding what sort of things arise and how we can best arrive at a conclusion in a pragmatic way. Third strategy would be to communicate in a non-critical way. And what that really means that I think there was a research from Google a few years back, basically about high performing teams. And one of the biggest factors for high performing teams, or I guess facets of that, would be psychological safety. And what that means is that people are safe, psychologically safe. They're not afraid to make mistakes, etc. Right? You want to create that sort of environment for your team to essentially ensure that you guys are working effectively, right? And what it means to communicate in a non-critical way is essentially, pretty intuitive, right? It just means making not things when conflicts arise, you don't want to make it personal, and you want to make sure that you're focusing on a topic at hand instead of, hurling insults or, making things about the other person, basically. Do you guys have any questions so far? If you do, just feel free to drop it in chat or just blurt something out as well. Cool. So the first few slides sort of covered how to work with your team and the best communication strategies. to and solution strategies for how to resolve conflicts, right? Next few slides will sort of focus more on leadership and culture, right? So with leadership, especially with as you're one of the founders of the startup, you're gonna have a huge role to play in sort of defining the early culture and right tone for your startup, right? And so some of these qualities of a great leader can be optimism, right? What that means is when things aren't going well, you have to be the one that says positive and fire up your team and motivate them, right? When everyone's sort of down, you have to be the one that keeps going, sort of being optimistic about this, ensuring that your startup is going in the right direction, aligned with your vision, right? Because if the leader's down, it just trickles down into the other members of the team as well, and it's just not a good state to be in, especially for a startup where there's a very low chance of success, and you want to make sure that you want to be optimistic as possible. Second quality would be you need to be a great decision maker, and you need to make decisions that are basically aligned to your long-term vision, and you need to make decisions that are data driven and logical, right? You can't just make decisions just because in an emotional way, in the sense that it feels right. You have to really look at the data and understand what's driving your decisions to make the most optimal ones for, that's aligned with the best interests of your startup and the company, right? So being selfless in that regard as well. And lastly, just being compassionate. So understanding and basically understanding your team, what sort of gets them motivated, how they function, etc. Oh, that's a good question. So I think Alex asked, when it comes to leadership, how would you balance optimism versus being realistic regarding certain issues, right? It's a very good question. I think you should always be in that sort of state of optimism in the sense that you should look at things on the bright side, but there is also sort of that facet where, things aren't, whatever you're doing, some things aren't working, and you would just really have to look at the data in that case, right? And understand that while this could work, you might need a pivot, right? So understand, like, just having that balance between like saying positive and understanding that things could work out, but also understanding that good portion of startups do fail eventually, right? So and understanding sort of the data behind that, are you really solving a solution and really solving a problem for users, and sort of understanding the like what you're solving here, and is that aligned? Exactly, yeah. Okay. Is it necessary to have a leader? How would it benefit for a small group of no leader? There doesn't necessarily have to be a leader, but just because you don't really have that defined leadership position, you should continue to have leadership qualities, right? If that makes sense, right? In a startup, everyone should sort of embody that sort of, especially the founders too, right? Because that really sets a tone for the other members that will essentially be joining later on. So you essentially want to set the tone and embody these leadership qualities, even though you're not like the main leader, if that makes sense. You're not the CEO or whatever, right? But you're still a founder of the startup, and you want to essentially ensure that whatever culture that you have is essentially positive and in the right direction, if that makes sense. Cool. Um, Next slide is essentially going to be how to build a good startup culture. So one of the big I guess steps of building a good culture is being proud of the solution. And what that really means is being proud of what you're solving. Are you passionate about the problem? You need to have that sort of right environment and energy where all the members on your team are sort of aligned on one page and understand like, you know, what problem you're solving and are you guys passionate about solving this, right? And understanding like just whatever solution you're coming up with, that you're proud of that and you really are trying to create the best solution possible. Two would be to create a long-term vision, right? Because without direction and a long-term vision, there's a lot of times where you guys can get lost, right? Especially with external factors like investors, etc. It's good to have from the very beginning have a vision for the future and what the plan is, right? Do you guys want to exit? Like, what's sort of the vision for this in like a long term thing? And others will essentially follow when they work, and this is really inspiring to employees when and attractive to others that are looking to join as well. Okay. Three, you need to make sure your vision is externally focused. And what that means is basically you want to be customer facing, right? You want to be attentive to the customers and really try to solve a solution that caters to them, right? You can't just come up with a solution that you think would work, but you have to really search out customers, talk to them, and understand their needs first, and really try to craft your vision and your solution to that problem that you're solving, right? You can't be selfish in that regard, and you have to really be data driven in that sense as well. Number four would be to build diversity. So diversity in all things, right? This could be like background, opinions, etc. Because having a team with no diversity, you really get into this mindset where you essentially have no differing opinions, and you're very biased to sort of that one opinion that you guys will all conform to in a way, right? So you want to essentially have diverse backgrounds, diverse set of opinions, and making sure there's a sort of balance in that regard. Five would be to develop a process, essentially promote this culture when hiring, onboarding, etc. Right? So when new people come in, you want to essentially give them your core values, like what do you guys stand for? What is your long-term vision? Essentially really have that trickle down, even as you guys expand to like a huge company later on as well, right? And lastly, you gotta plan on evolving, right? While as the founders and sort of the co-founders of the startup, initially you're going to have a big part in culture, right? But as a startup as it evolves from like maybe like a 5-person team to a 100-person team to thousands, right? Things change, right? And maybe your solution even changes as well. Like there's pivots along the way, and you need to be flexible in your culture, I guess, with little things, but also understand that this culture can sort of evolve into something different as well as you guys grow and expand, obviously. Cool. That's just about it for the presentation. Thank you guys for coming. Do you guys have any questions? And I'll stop recording as well right here.